Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Kestrel Thorne and I am 24 years old. I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park for 8 months. I was still new to the job, still desperately trying to prove I belonged among the seasoned rangers who'd been protecting these ancient forests for decades when the missing person case of Iris Blackwood turned into something that still haunts me. The call came in at 4:47 p.m. on October 15th, just as the autumn darkness was beginning to creep between the towering Douglas firs. I was finishing my patrol report when Ranger Supervisor Martinez's voice crackled through my radio, with that particular tension that meant someone was in real trouble. Thorne, we've got a missing person, 19-year-old college student name of Iris Blackwood, last seen 3 days ago at the Hoh River trailhead. Her car's still in the parking lot, and her roommate back in Seattle says she was supposed to return 2 days ago. I felt my stomach clench. 3 days in October, weather could mean hypothermia, injury, or worse, but this was also my chance. The first missing person case I'd be assigned as primary searcher since completing my training. The other rangers still treated me like the rookie I was, politely but firmly suggesting I stick to trail maintenance and visitor education while they handled the real emergencies. Copy that, I radioed back, trying to keep the eagerness out of my voice. What's the search plan? You'll take the northern quadrant starting at first light. Henderson and Vasquez are covering the river areas. I want hourly check-ins, and if you find so much as a gum wrapper, you radio it in immediately. Weather's supposed to turn tonight, fog rolling in around midnight. The parking lot at Hoh River was eerily quiet when I arrived at dawn. Iris's Honda Civic sat alone in the gravel, covered in 3 days' worth of morning dew and fallen leaves. I peered through the windows. Her camera bag was gone, but she'd left a half-eaten energy bar on the passenger seat and a thermos of what looked like cold coffee. Everything about the scene felt wrong. Why would she leave food behind if she was planning an extended hike? I popped the trunk with the keys her roommate had provided. Inside, I found something that made my blood run cold. Her sleeping bag, still in its stuff sack, along with a full pack of emergency supplies. No experienced photographer would venture into the Olympic wilderness without proper gear, especially not in October. Either Iris Blackwood was catastrophically unprepared, or she'd encountered something that prevented her from returning to her car. The Hoh River Trail stretched into the temperate rainforest like a green tunnel. Ancient Sitka spruces and western hemlocks formed a cathedral ceiling hundreds of feet overhead, their trunks draped in moss so thick it muffled sound. The air smelled of decomposing leaves, wet earth, and something else, something metallic that made my sinuses burn. I'd studied this terrain obsessively during training, memorizing every creek crossing and shelter location. The trail was well maintained for the first 5 miles, then branched into a network of secondary paths that wound deeper into the wilderness. If Iris had gotten lost, she could be anywhere in a 100-square-mile area of some of the most impenetrable forest in North America. My radio crackled to life as I reached the first trail junction. Thorne, this is Martinez. Any sign of our missing person? Negative so far. I'm at junction marker 3, heading northwest toward Elk Lake. The trail's been heavily used. Too many footprints to isolate individual tracks. Copy. Henderson found something interesting down by the river. Some kind of makeshift camp looked like it had been abandoned quickly. Keep your eyes open for anything unusual. Unusual? In 8 months of ranger work, I'd learned that unusual in the Olympic wilderness could mean anything from illegal marijuana grows to black bear encounters. But as I pushed deeper into the forest, I began to notice things that raised the hair on the back of my neck. The first was the silence. October was migration season. The forest should have been alive with bird calls and the rustle of small mammals preparing for winter. Instead, there was only the drip of moisture from moss-covered branches and the distant whisper of wind through the canopy. It was as if every living thing had fled the area. The second thing I noticed was the smell. That metallic tang was getting stronger. mixed now with something organic and rotten that made my stomach churn. I'd encountered decomposing wildlife before, but this was different, sharper, more complex. Human scent mixed with fear sweat and something else I couldn't identify. I was following what looked like a game trail about 2 miles off the main path when I found the first symbol. It was carved deep into the bark of a massive cedar, about 8 feet off the ground. The cuts were fresh, sap still leaked from the wounds in the tree's flesh. The symbol itself was unlike anything I'd seen in my wilderness survival training. A circle intersected by 3 jagged lines that looked almost like claws. Below it, smaller marks formed what might have been letters in some language I didn't recognize. My hands shook as I photographed the carving with my park-issued camera. This wasn't random vandalism. The cuts were too precise, too deliberate. Someone had taken considerable time and effort to create this symbol, and they'd chosen a location deep enough in the wilderness that it might never be discovered. I keyed my radio. "Martinez, this is Thorne. I found something you need to see. About 2 miles northwest of junction marker 3, there's a tree with some kind of carved symbol. It looks recent." Static answered me. I tried again, checking my radio's frequency and battery level. Everything appeared normal, but I couldn't raise anyone on any channel. The Olympic Mountains were notorious for creating dead zones in radio coverage, but I'd been communicating fine just an hour earlier. I was studying my GPS unit, trying to mark the exact coordinates of the symbol, when I noticed the second carving. This one was on a Douglas fir about 50 yards away, positioned so that anyone following the game trail would see it clearly. The same circle and claw marks, but this time accompanied by what looked disturbingly like human figures, stick drawings of people with their arms and legs splayed in unnatural positions. A cold wind rustled through the canopy, sending a cascade of yellow maple leaves spiraling down around me. The temperature was dropping fast, and the sky visible through the forest ceiling had turned the gray-white color that meant fog was rolling in from the Pacific. I had maybe 3 hours of useful daylight left. I found the third symbol a quarter mile later, and this time there was no mistaking its meaning. The carving showed the same circle and claw marks, but now the stick figures were clearly depicted in various stages of dismemberment. Worse, someone had filled the carved lines with what looked like dried blood, giving the symbols a rust-red color that stood out starkly against the dark bark. My training told me to retreat immediately, call for backup and establish a perimeter, but my radio was still dead, and every minute I delayed was another minute that Iris Blackwood might be suffering. The rookie in me whispered that this was my chance to prove myself, to show the veteran rangers that I could handle a real crisis. The growing knot of fear in my gut suggested that I was in way over my head. I pushed forward. The trail led deeper into old-growth forest where the trees grew so close together that the afternoon light could barely penetrate. The air grew thick and humid, filled with the earthy smell of fungal decay. My boots squelched through patches of mud that seemed to appear randomly across the path, as if the ground itself was slowly liquefying. It was in one of these muddy sections that I found the first clear footprint. The track was pressed deep into soft earth beside a rotting log, size 7 or 8 hiking boot with a distinctive waffle pattern on the sole. But what made my blood freeze was the second set of prints following close behind, much larger, with a tread pattern I didn't recognize. The smaller prints showed signs of stumbling, sliding, as if their owner had been running. The larger prints followed with the steady, measured pace of a predator tracking wounded prey. I photographed both sets of tracks, my camera flash creating stark shadows in the growing gloom. The timestamp showed 3:42 p.m. I had maybe an hour of decent light remaining. My GPS unit showed I was now almost 4 miles from the nearest marked trail, deep in territory that most park visitors never saw. The tracks led to a small clearing where the forest opened up around a natural spring. The ground here was soft and marshy, crisscrossed with game trails and dotted with fallen logs covered in luminescent moss. And scattered around the clearing like some twisted art installation were more symbols, carved into trees, scratched into rocks, even formed from arranged sticks and bones on the forest floor. But it was what I found at the center of the clearing that made me understand I was dealing with something far worse than a simple missing person case. Someone had built a structure from fallen branches and moss-covered stones. Not a shelter, but something that looked disturbingly like an altar. The construction was crude but purposeful, about waist-high and roughly circular. Dark stains covered the flat stone surface, and the ground around it was churned with footprints from multiple people. Hanging from the surrounding trees were objects that made my stomach lurch. Pieces of clothing, personal items, and things I didn't want to examine too closely. A woman's hiking boot dangled from a cedar branch, its laces cut rather than untied. A backpack hung gutted and empty, its contents scattered on the forest floor. And swaying gently in the evening breeze was a camera, an expensive digital SLR that matched the description of Iris Blackwood's equipment. I approached the altar with my service weapon drawn. Though my hands shook so badly I could barely keep the pistol steady. The stone surface was covered in symbols carved deep into the rock. The same circle and claw marks I'd been following, but now accompanied by elaborate designs that looked like some perverted combination of religious iconography and serial killer fantasy. The dark stains weren't just on the altar. They formed patterns radiating out from the central stone, as if someone had been very deliberate about how they spilled whatever liquid had created them. I didn't need forensic training to recognize the rusty brown color and metallic smell of dried blood. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, weapon raised, scanning the tree line that surrounded the clearing. The forest had grown completely silent. Even the ever-present drip of moisture from the canopy had stopped. The air felt heavy, expectant, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "Olympic National Park Ranger," I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "If there's anyone out there, I need you to show yourself with your hands visible." The silence stretched until I began to wonder if I'd imagined the sound. Then, from somewhere to my left, came the soft whisper of cloth brushing against bark. Someone was moving through the trees with the careful stealth of a predator, or someone who had every reason to avoid discovery. I keyed my radio again, desperate to reach Martinez or Henderson, or anyone who might be listening. "This is Ranger Thorne requesting immediate backup at coordinates." I read off the GPS numbers, knowing even as I spoke that the transmission was probably going nowhere. The radio gave me nothing but static in return. Another sound, closer this time, the deliberate scrape of a boot on stone. Whoever was out there was circling the clearing, staying just out of sight among the massive tree trunks. I turned slowly, trying to keep the entire perimeter in view, but the forest was too dense and the light too dim to see more than a few yards in any direction. "I know you're there," I called out, putting every ounce of authority I could muster into my voice. "Come out where I can see you. If you know anything about Iris Blackwood, we need to talk." The response came from directly behind me, so close I could feel breath on my neck. She screamed so beautifully, I spun around and saw him for the first time, a tall, gaunt figure standing at the edge of the clearing like some nightmarish scarecrow. His clothes were a patchwork of animal skins and dirty fabric, decorated with bones and feathers that clattered softly as he moved. His face was painted with symbols that matched the tree carvings, giving him the appearance of some prehistoric shaman stepped out of humanity's darkest dreams. But it was his eyes that made my blood turn to ice water. They held the flat, emotionless stare of a predator evaluating prey, calculating, patient, utterly without mercy. "Where is she?" I demanded, keeping my weapon trained on his center mass. "Where is Iris Blackwood?" He smiled, revealing teeth filed to sharp points. "The forest has accepted her offering. She has been purified, cleansed of the pollution that modern humanity carries. Soon you will join her in sacred communion with the true spirits of this place." "You're under arrest," I said, though the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. We were miles from backup with no radio contact and night falling fast. This wasn't an arrest situation. This was a survival situation. He laughed, a sound like wind whistling through dead branches. "Your laws mean nothing here, little ranger. This is sacred ground, older than your civilization, older than your corruption. I am merely an instrument of purification." That's when I realized he wasn't alone. Movement in the trees revealed at least two other figures circling the clearing with the coordinated precision of a hunting pack. They moved with an eerie synchronization, stepping lightly despite the forest floor's covering of dead leaves and fallen branches. Like their leader, they were decorated with symbols and animal remains, their faces painted in patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the failing light. I was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and completely cut off from help. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, but my training held me in place. A park ranger's first duty was to protect human life, and somewhere out there, Iris Blackwood might still be alive. "Let me see her," I said, trying to project calm authority while my heart hammered against my ribs. "Let me verify she's safe, and we can discuss whatever grievances you have with the Park Service." The leader tilted his head like a curious bird. "Grievances? You misunderstand, little ranger. We have no quarrel with your bureaucracy. We serve a higher purpose, the restoration of natural order. Humanity is a disease, and we are the cure." One of the other figures spoke up from the shadows, their voice distorted by some kind of mask or face covering. "She fought well, this photographer, but the forest spirits demanded her sacrifice. They demand yours as well." That's when I saw the blood on his hands, fresh blood that gleamed wet in the dim light. Iris Blackwood's blood. My rookie training evaporated in an instant, replaced by pure animal terror. I fired 3 shots at the leader, the muzzle flashes illuminating the clearing in stark white snapshots. One shot splintered bark behind him, but the other 2 found their mark, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the underbrush. The other 2 attackers melted into the forest with inhuman speed, their painted faces disappearing among the shadows like malevolent spirits. I heard them moving through the trees, coordinating their approach with soft calls that sounded disturbingly like bird songs. I had maybe 6 rounds left in my service weapon, no backup, and night was falling fast. The smart thing would be to retreat immediately, but I couldn't leave without knowing what had happened to Iris Blackwood, if there was even a chance she was still alive. The wounded leader groaned from where he'd fallen, still moving but clearly hurt badly. I approached with my weapon ready, scanning the tree line for his companions. Up close, I could see that beneath the paint and primitive decorations, he was probably in his 40s with the lean build of someone who'd lived off the land for years. Multiple scars covered his exposed arms and torso, some old, some fresh, all deliberately inflicted. "Where is she?" I demanded, pressing my boot against his wounded shoulder. He screamed, but the sound held more rage than pain. "Gone. Purified. The spirits have taken her home," he gasped. "You cannot stop the cleansing. Others will come. The forest will be made pure." A stick snapped to my left. I spun toward the sound and saw one of his companions moving between the trees, trying to flank my position. The painted face was visible for just a moment before disappearing again behind a massive cedar trunk. I was being hunted. The realization hit me like a physical blow. These weren't random killers or even ordinary cultists. They were predators who'd chosen the Olympic wilderness as their hunting ground. They knew every trail, every hiding place, every advantage the terrain could offer. And I was alone, inexperienced, and rapidly running out of daylight. I grabbed the wounded man's collar and hauled him to his feet, using him as a human shield as I backed toward the game trail that had brought me here. "Call them off," I ordered. "Tell your friends to back away or I'll put another bullet in you." He laughed, blood frothing from his lips. "Death means nothing to us. We serve the eternal forest. Kill me, and 2 more will take my place. The purification cannot be stopped." A sound like a hunting horn echoed through the trees, low, mournful, and definitely not made by any animal native to the Pacific Northwest. It was answered by similar calls from at least 3 different directions. They were coordinating, communicating, setting up for a coordinated attack. I shoved my prisoner ahead of me and started moving toward what I hoped was the trail back to civilization. The forest had become a maze of shadows and half-seen movement. Every rustle of leaves could be the wind or a human predator positioning for attack. My flashlight beam created dancing pools of light that only emphasized how much darkness surrounded me. We'd gone maybe 100 yards when my prisoner suddenly went limp, his full weight pulling against my grip on his collar. I looked down and saw the wooden handle of a knife protruding from between his shoulder blades. One of his companions had killed him rather than let him be captured. A voice called out from the darkness, distorted by distance and the acoustic properties of the forest. "You cannot save her, Ranger. She belongs to the forest now. Soon you will join her." I dropped the body and ran. The game trail was invisible in the darkness, marked only by slightly less dense vegetation and the occasional gap in the canopy overhead. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I stumbled over roots and fallen branches, making enough noise to wake the dead. Behind me, I could hear them following, at least two, maybe more, moving through the underbrush with the confidence of predators in familiar territory. I tried my radio again, knowing it was hopeless, but unable to stop myself from trying. "Mayday, mayday. This is Ranger Thorne requesting immediate assistance. I have multiple armed suspects, at least one fatality. Officer needs help." Static answered me, punctuated by what sounded almost like laughter. Were they somehow jamming my communications? The thought was paranoid, but everything about this situation had moved far beyond normal law enforcement parameters. A branch whipped across my face, leaving a line of fire across my cheek. I stumbled, caught myself against a tree trunk, and kept moving. The forest seemed to be actively fighting my escape attempt. Roots grabbed at my ankles, low branches caught my clothes, and patches of mud appeared in my path like natural snares. That's when I heard her scream. It came from somewhere ahead and to the right, high-pitched and filled with absolute terror. Iris Blackwood was still alive, and she was close. Every instinct I had screamed at me to keep running, to get out of the forest and bring back the cavalry. But I was a park ranger sworn to protect the people who visited this wilderness. If I ran now, she would die alone in these dark woods. I changed course, pushing through a tangle of Devil's Club and Salmonberry toward the Sound. The vegetation here was dense enough to provide some cover, but it also meant I was making even more noise as I forced my way through. My pursuers would have no trouble following my trail. The scream came again, closer now and definitely human. It was coming from a depression in the forest floor where a seasonal creek had carved a narrow ravine. I worked my way down the steep bank, using tree roots for handholds and trying not to think about how exposed I was to anyone watching from above. I found her tied to a fallen log at the bottom of the ravine, barely conscious and covered in cuts that looked deliberately inflicted. Iris Blackwood was alive, but she wouldn't be for much longer without immediate medical attention. Her photographer's eye was swollen shut, and blood had dried in dark streaks down her face from wounds that matched the claw-like symbols I'd been seeing carved into trees. "Iris?" I whispered, cutting her bonds with my utility knife. "I'm Ranger Thorne. I'm here to get you out." Her good eye focused on me with difficulty. They're everywhere," she gasped. "Been hunting me for days, playing with me, said I was practice for something bigger." I got her arm around my shoulders and started helping her up the ravine slope. She was weak but mobile. Whatever they'd done to her, they'd been careful not to damage her ability to run. That thought made my skin crawl. They'd been deliberately prolonging her suffering, using her as bait. "How many are there?" I asked as we climbed. "Don't know. At least 5, maybe more. They take turns, watching me, hunting me, like a game." Her voice was barely a whisper, but I could hear the steel underneath. Iris Blackwood was a survivor. We reached the top of the ravine just as the hunting horn sounded again, much closer this time. They knew exactly where we were, and they were closing in. My flashlight picked out movement in the trees, painted faces appearing and disappearing among the shadows, always just at the edge of vision. "Can you run?" I asked. She nodded, though I could see the effort it cost her. "Which way?" That was the million-dollar question. I checked my GPS unit and realized with growing horror that we were now almost 6 miles from the nearest road, in terrain that would be challenging even in daylight with proper equipment. In the dark, injured and pursued, our chances of reaching safety were minimal. But we had to try. I chose a direction that led roughly toward the main park road and started moving, supporting Iris as much as possible, while trying to maintain a pace that would keep us ahead of our pursuers. The forest floor was treacherous in the darkness. Hidden roots, fallen branches, and patches of mud that could turn an ankle or send us sprawling. Behind us, the hunting calls grew more frequent and more urgent. They were communicating, coordinating their pursuit like a pack of wolves. How long had they been operating in Olympic National Park? How many other victims had there been that we'd never found? We'd been moving for maybe 20 minutes when Iris collapsed. Her legs simply gave out, sending both of us tumbling into a patch of ferns. When I helped her sit up, I could see that her wounds were bleeding again and her face had gone pale with shock and exhaustion. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't go any further." I checked our position on the GPS. We were still 3 miles from the road, in some of the roughest terrain in the park. At our current pace, it would take hours to reach safety, if we could maintain any pace at all. And behind us, the hunting calls were getting closer. "Yes, you can," I told her, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "We just need to find somewhere to hide until morning. Once the sun comes up, I can signal for help." That's when I remembered the emergency shelter. Every experienced ranger knew about the unofficial refugees scattered throughout the Olympic wilderness. Old cabins, caves, abandoned research stations that could provide temporary shelter in an emergency. There was supposed to be one about a mile north of our position, an old Forest Service cabin that had been used for fire lookout duty decades ago. If we could reach it, we'd have walls between us and the cultists. If we could hold out until dawn, I could use my emergency flare gun to signal for rescue. I got Iris back on her feet and changed our heading north, following what looked like an old logging road that had been reclaimed by the forest. The going was easier here, though we were more exposed to anyone tracking us. Every few minutes one of the hunting horns would sound, and I'd estimate they were getting closer. The cabin appeared out of the darkness like something from a fairy tale. A small log structure with a steep-pitched roof, surrounded by towering evergreens. It had obviously been abandoned for years. The windows were boarded up, and moss grew thick on the roof. But it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. I helped Iris up the steps and tried the door. Locked, but the wood around the latch was rotted enough that a good shoulder check would break it open. The door gave way with a crack that echoed through the forest, and we stumbled inside. The cabin's interior smelled of dust, mold, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that reminded me of the altar back in the clearing. My flashlight revealed a single room with a stone fireplace, some basic furniture, and something that made my blood freeze. The walls were covered in the same symbols I'd been seeing carved into trees, but these weren't carved. They'd been painted on the wood in what looked like dried blood. The floor was stained with dark patches that formed patterns radiating out from the center of the room, and hanging from the rafters were trophies, personal items, pieces of clothing, and worse, things that I didn't want to examine too closely. "This isn't a shelter," Iris whispered. "It's their temple." The hunting horn sounded right outside the cabin, followed by voices speaking in that strange language I'd heard earlier. We were trapped in their sacred space, surrounded by evidence of previous victims. The irony was so perfect it had to be intentional. They'd herded us exactly where they wanted us. I barricaded the door with what furniture I could move, knowing it wouldn't hold them for long. My service weapon had maybe 4 rounds left, and I had one emergency flare that might serve as a weapon if things got desperate enough. "There." Iris pointed to a trapdoor in the floor that I'd missed in my initial scan of the room. "Where does that go?" I pulled up the wooden panel and shined my flashlight into the opening. A ladder led down into what looked like a root cellar or basement. The air that wafted up was cold and dank, carrying that same metallic smell I'd been noticing all day. "I don't think we want to go down there," I said. A window shutter exploded inward in a shower of splinters, followed by a painted face that grinned at us with filed teeth. I put a bullet through it, and the face disappeared with a scream. But now they knew exactly where we were, and I was down to 3 rounds. More shutters burst open around the cabin's perimeter. I caught glimpses of painted faces, primitive weapons, and eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's. They were toying with us, building up the fear before the final assault. "The cellar," I told Iris. "It's our only chance." She went down the ladder first, and I followed, pulling the trapdoor closed above us. The space below was larger than I'd expected, a natural cave that extended back into the hillside beyond the cabin's foundation. But it was what the cave contained that made me understand the true scope of the horror we'd stumbled into. They were everywhere. The remains of previous victims, arranged in grotesque displays that seemed to follow some twisted religious logic. Bones had been assembled into complex geometric patterns, and skulls stared at us from niches carved into the rock walls. The metallic smell was overwhelming down here, mixed with the sweet stench of decay. "How many people?" Iris whispered. I played my flashlight beam over the displays, trying to count individual victims. Dozens, maybe more. This has been going on for years. A wooden beam creaked overhead as footsteps moved across the cabin floor. They were inside now, searching for us. It wouldn't take them long to find the trapdoor. I explored deeper into the cave, hoping to find another exit. The tunnel branched several times, creating a warren of interconnected chambers. Some contained more bone displays. Others held what looked like ritual tools. Knives, clubs, and implements whose purpose I didn't want to contemplate. In the deepest chamber, I found something that gave me hope. A natural chimney in the rock that led upward toward the surface. It would be a difficult climb, especially with Iris in her weakened condition, but it might be our only chance to escape without confronting our pursuers directly. A crash from above told us they'd found the trapdoor. Voices echoed down the shaft, that strange language punctuated by what sounded like prayers or chants. They were coming down. "Up there," I told Iris, pointing to the chimney. "Can you climb?" She looked at the narrow opening and nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you. Go." The rock walls of the chimney were rough enough to provide handholds, and the space was narrow enough that we could brace ourselves between opposing walls. Iris started climbing with the determination of someone who knew this was her last chance at survival. Below us, flashlight beams began probing the cave system. They'd find our trail soon enough. We'd left plenty of footprints in the dusty floor. I waited until Iris was well up the chimney before starting my own climb. The rock scraped against my back and chest as I worked my way upward, following the irregular shaft toward what I hoped was an opening to the surface. My equipment belt caught on every projection, and more than once I had to stop and work myself free from some narrow point in the passage. Above me, Iris had stopped climbing. "I can see stars," she called down softly. "There's an opening, but it's small." I could hear our pursuers entering the deepest chamber below, their voices echoing up the chimney like sounds from hell itself. They'd found our escape route. Some of them were probably already starting to climb. "Squeeze through," I told Iris. "Whatever it takes." I heard her grunt with effort, followed by the sound of rock scraping against fabric. Then her voice came from outside. "I'm out. Hurry." The opening was barely wide enough for my shoulders. I had to exhale completely and push myself through inch by inch, feeling like the rock was going to crush my rib cage. My equipment belt caught on the lip of the opening, and for a terrifying moment I thought I was stuck. Then something gave way with a rip of fabric, and I popped out onto the forest floor like a cork from a bottle. We were on a hillside about a quarter-mile from the cabin, hidden among a grove of young cedars. Below us, I could see flashlight beams moving around the log structure as the cultists searched for signs of where we'd gone. They'd probably figure out the chimney route eventually, but it would take time. "Which way now?" Iris whispered. I checked my GPS and compass, trying to orient myself in the darkness. We were still at least 2 miles from the nearest road, but there was a fire access trail that ran along the ridgeline above us. If we could reach it, we could follow it to a communications tower where my radio might finally work. "Up," I said. "We need to get to higher ground." The climb was brutal. The hillside was steep and covered with deadfall from recent storms. Iris was running on pure adrenaline now, her injuries forgotten in the desperate need to escape. I stayed close behind her, listening for sounds of pursuit and trying to plan our next move. We reached the ridge just as the first pale hint of dawn began to appear in the eastern sky. The fire access road was little more than a dirt track, but it was level ground and clear of obstacles. More importantly, it led directly to a Forest Service communications tower that I could see silhouetted against the lightning sky about a mile away. My radio crackled to life as we gained elevation. "Anyone copy? Multiple units responding. Ranger Thorne, please respond. This is Thorne, I nearly shouted into the handset. I have the missing person, Iris Blackwood. We're alive, but we have multiple suspects in pursuit. We're approaching the Elk Ridge Communications Tower requesting immediate backup and medical assistance. Martinez's voice came back clear and strong. Thorne, we've been looking for you all night. What's your status? We've got a cult or terrorist group operating in the Ho River area. Multiple homicides, ritual killings. They've been using an old Forest Service cabin as some kind of temple. I count at least 5 suspects armed and extremely dangerous. Copy that. We've got state police and FBI en route. Can you hold your position at the tower? I looked back down the ridge and saw flashlight beams moving up the hillside. They were still coming, still hunting. But the sky was getting brighter, and help was finally on the way. We'll try, I said. The communications tower was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, a legacy from the days when it had been used for military communications. The gate was locked, but the fence wasn't particularly high. I helped Iris climb over, then followed, tearing my uniform shirt on the wire in the process. The tower itself was a skeletal steel structure about 60 feet tall, with a small equipment building at its base. The building was locked, but its walls would provide some protection if our pursuers caught up with us. I used the butt of my pistol to break a window and helped Iris inside. The interior was filled with electronic equipment and had the sterile smell of ozone and heated metal. Most importantly, it had a landline telephone. I grabbed the handset and dialed the Park Service emergency number. This is Ranger Thorne at the Elk Ridge Tower. I need you to patch me through to the FBI task force that should be responding to our location. Within minutes, I was talking to an agent who told me that a joint law enforcement task force was less than 10 minutes out. All I had to do was keep Iris safe for a few more minutes. That's when I heard the sound that made my blood run cold. The hunting horn, blown from multiple positions around the tower's perimeter. They had us surrounded. Through the broken window, I could see painted faces appearing at the fence line. There had to be at least 8 of them, maybe more. They'd been joined by reinforcements during the night, turning our escape into their final hunting ground. One of them stepped forward, a tall woman with elaborate scarification covering her face and arms. She carried what looked like a primitive spear decorated with feathers and bones. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the distance. "The purification must be completed," she called out. "The forest spirits demand their sacrifice. Send out the photographer, Little Ranger, and your death will be quick." "Federal agents are on their way," I shouted back, though my voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "Surrender now and you might live to see a courtroom." She laughed, the same bone-chilling sound I'd heard from her companion in the clearing. "Your laws are the infection we seek to cure. This sacred ground will run red before we allow it to be defiled by your civilization's corruption." I counted my remaining ammunition. 2 bullets left in my service weapon, plus the emergency flare gun. Against at least 8 armed cultists who knew the terrain better than I did and had been planning this moment for who knew how long. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the valley, still distant, but getting closer. The cavalry was coming, but would they arrive in time? The cultists began to move, scaling the fence with an ease that suggested they'd done this before. Their painted faces were expressionless in the growing dawn light, showing the flat effect of people completely committed to their cause. These weren't random killers or even ordinary fanatics. They were true believers convinced that murder was a sacred act. I helped Iris barricade ourselves in the equipment room using a metal desk and filing cabinets. The building's concrete walls would stop most projectiles, but there were too many windows, and the door wasn't designed to withstand a determined assault. "They're going to kill us, aren't they?" Iris whispered. I wanted to lie, to offer false comfort in what might be our final minutes, but she deserved the truth. "They're going to try, but help is coming, and I'm not going down without a fight." The first spear punched through the broken window, its obsidian point embedding in the opposite wall with enough force to crack the concrete. A second spear followed, then a third. They were probing our defenses, testing our resolve. I fired through the window at a painted face that appeared for just a moment among the fence posts. The bullet sparked off steel mesh, but the face disappeared. 1 round left. The helicopter was closer now. I could hear the distinctive whoop 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 of rotor blades echoing off the surrounding ridges. But it would still be several minutes before it could reach us, and the cultists were done with preliminaries. They came through the window simultaneously, 3 painted figures moving with the fluid coordination of a military unit. I put my last bullet into the chest of the first one, but the second was on me before I could draw the flare gun. We went down in a tangle of limbs, his filed teeth snapping at my throat while his hands tried to find my windpipe. I managed to get the flare gun free and jammed it against his ribs. The emergency flare detonated with a burst of phosphorus and flame that filled the small room with acrid smoke. He screamed and rolled away, his primitive clothing on fire. The third cultist had grabbed Iris and was dragging her toward the door, a stone knife pressed against her throat. Her photographer's instincts had kicked in. Even in mortal terror, she was observing, cataloging, preparing to bear witness if she survived. I tackled him from behind, and we all went down in a heap. The knife clattered across the concrete floor, and I heard Iris scramble away toward the relative safety of the overturned desk. The cultist beneath me was wiry but strong, with the lean muscle of someone who'd lived off the land for years. He fought with the desperate strength of a cornered animal. His painted face was inches from mine as we struggled, and I could see the madness in his eyes, the absolute certainty that what he was doing was not just justified but holy. There would be no reasoning with these people, no negotiation or compromise. They would kill us both or die trying. I got my hands around his throat and squeezed, feeling the cartilage compress beneath my fingers. He clawed at my face, leaving bloody furrows across my cheek, but I held on. His struggles grew weaker, his painted face turning purple beneath the ritual markings. That's when the cavalry arrived. The sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from outside, short, controlled bursts that meant professional soldiers rather than local law enforcement. Shouts in English mixed with screams in that strange cultist language. The FBI's hostage rescue team had found us. The cultist beneath me went limp, either unconscious or dead. I rolled off him and crawled to where Iris was huddled behind the overturned desk. She was bleeding from several cuts, but alive and conscious. "Is it over?" she whispered. The gunfire outside was sporadic now, single shots rather than full automatic. Someone with a bullhorn was shouting commands about surrender and federal arrest warrants. Most of the cultists were probably dead or captured, but I wouldn't feel safe until we were in federal custody. "Stay down," I told her. "Don't move until someone in a uniform comes to get us." It took another 20 minutes for the area to be secured. When FBI agents finally entered the equipment building, they found us huddled together among the bodies and debris of our final stand. The lead agent, a woman about my age with short blonde hair and the kind of intense stare that suggested she'd seen too much violence, introduced herself as Special Agent Collins. "You two are extremely lucky to be alive," she said, helping us to our feet. "We've been tracking this cult for 3 years across 4 different states. They call themselves the Purifiers, and they've been responsible for at least 15 confirmed murders that we know of." "How did you find us?" I asked. "When you didn't check in last night, your supervisor contacted the FBI. We've had this area under surveillance for weeks, kept getting reports of missing hikers and strange symbols carved into trees. When we heard your radio transmission this morning, we were already mobilizing." As they helped us out of the building, I got my first clear look at the aftermath. 4 cultists were dead, 3 more were in custody, and 1 had apparently escaped into the forest. The survivors sat in the dirt with their hands zip-tied behind their backs, their painted faces now smeared with blood and tears. "There are more," I told Agent Collins. "Underground, in a cave system beneath an old Forest Service cabin. Dozens of victims, maybe more. They've been operating here for years." She nodded grimly. "We know. The cabin was the first place we hit this morning. Our forensic teams are already processing the scene." She paused, studying my face. "You did good work, Ranger Thorne. A lot of people are alive today because you didn't give up." The helicopter ride to the hospital was a blur of pain medication and emergency medical treatment. Iris was in worse shape than I was. Her 3 days of captivity had left her dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from multiple injuries that would require surgery. But she was alive, and she was talking, giving detailed statements to the FBI agents who would build the case against the surviving purifiers. I spent 2 days in the hospital recovering from exhaustion, dehydration, and the various cuts and bruises I'd accumulated during our escape. The media attention was overwhelming. The story of a rookie park ranger and a college student surviving a cult's hunting ritual made national headlines. I gave a few interviews, trying to focus attention on the victims rather than my own actions. The full scope of the purifiers' crimes became clear over the following weeks. They'd been operating in remote wilderness areas across the Pacific Northwest for at least 5 years, targeting solo hikers and campers who wouldn't be missed immediately. The cave system beneath the Forest Service cabin contained the remains of 23 confirmed victims, with evidence suggesting there might be other burial sites elsewhere in the Olympic Mountains. The surviving cultists were eventually convicted on federal terrorism and murder charges. Their leader, the scarred woman who'd spoken to us at the communications tower, received life in prison without parole. She showed no remorse during her trial, maintaining that her actions had been necessary to purify the wilderness of human contamination. I returned to work 6 weeks later, though I requested a transfer to a different section of the park. Walking those same trails where I'd been hunted was more than my damaged psyche could handle. My supervisor, Martinez, was understanding. He'd seen what prolonged exposure to violence could do to even experienced rangers. But the nightmares followed me anyway. I still wake up sometimes, heart pounding, convinced I can hear that hunting horn echoing through the darkness. The sound of wind in the trees reminds me of painted faces moving through shadows. And every time I encounter a solo hiker on a remote trail, I find myself scanning their face for signs of filed teeth or ritual scarification. Iris Blackwood recovered from her physical injuries, though she never returned to photography. She changed her major to psychology and now works as a trauma counselor, helping other survivors of violent crimes. We stayed in touch for a while, bonded by the shared experience that had nearly killed us both. But eventually, we drifted apart. Sometimes the things that unite people are too painful to revisit regularly. The official investigation concluded that the purifiers had been operating for years without detection, using their knowledge of wilderness survival to remain hidden in remote areas of national parks and forests. They'd developed their own twisted theology that viewed modern civilization as a contamination that needed to be purged from sacred natural spaces. What the official reports couldn't capture was the pure evil I'd seen in their eyes, the absolute certainty that murder was not just acceptable but holy. These weren't people driven to violence by desperation or mental illness. They were intelligent, organized predators who'd chosen to prey on innocent people for ideological reasons. The experience changed me in ways that took years to fully understand. My faith in human nature was permanently damaged, replaced by a hard-won awareness that the most dangerous predator in any wilderness is often another human being. I became hypervigilant, unable to relax completely, even in supposedly safe environments. But it also taught me something about my own capacity for survival. When everything was stripped away, training, backup, communication, hope, I'd found reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. I'd kept fighting when giving up would have been easier, and I'd saved a life in the process. That knowledge helped me through the dark months that followed, when every shadow seemed to hide a painted face and every unexpected sound made me reach for a weapon. It reminded me that even in the face of absolute evil, ordinary people could choose to do extraordinary things. 6 months after the attack, I received a letter forwarded through the FBI. It was from one of the captured purifiers, not their leader, but one of the younger members who'd been sentenced to 25 years for his role in the murders. The letter was brief and written in the same strange script I'd seen carved into trees. The forest remembers, little ranger. The purification cannot be stopped by your laws or your bullets. Others will take our place. The sacred work will continue. I burned the letter that same day, but I couldn't burn the message. Somewhere out there, other predators were watching and waiting, choosing their victims and planning their attacks. The Olympic Mountains stretched for hundreds of miles, full of remote valleys and hidden caves where terrible things could happen far from any help. That's the truth I live with now, 3 years later. Every time I put on my ranger uniform and venture into the wilderness I've sworn to protect. The forests are beautiful and ancient and sacred, deserving of our protection and respect. but they're also hunting grounds for the worst impulses of human nature, places where evil can flourish in isolation. I still love my job. I still believe in the mission of protecting America's natural treasures for future generations. But I do it now with the hard-won knowledge that the greatest threats to park visitors aren't bears or falling rocks or getting lost in a blizzard. The greatest threats are other humans who've chosen to embrace the darkness that exists in every one of us. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in a ranger station surrounded by millions of acres of wilderness, I can still hear that hunting horn echoing through the darkness, calling to others who share the purifier's twisted vision of natural purity. The forest remembers, and so do I. My name is Kestrel Thorne, and I survived something that still visits me in my dreams. But I also learned that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when faced with absolute evil. I learned that survival isn't just about training or equipment or backup. It's about the choice to keep fighting when everything looks hopeless. And most importantly, I learned that the wilderness I've dedicated my life to protecting isn't just threatened by development or climate change or budget cuts. It's threatened by people who've forgotten what it means to be human. The hunt never really ends. It just moves to new territory, finds new victims, adapts to new challenges. But as long as there are people willing to stand guard in the darkness, willing to fight for those who can't fight for themselves, the predators won't have it all their own way. That's what I tell myself when the nightmares come. That's what keeps me going when the job seems impossible and the darkness too vast to hold back. Someone has to stand watch. Someone has to be ready when the hunting horn sounds again. Someone has to remember that the most dangerous predator in any wilderness walks on two legs and calls itself human. My name is Ezra Thorne, and I am 28 years old. I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park for 8 months. This happened during the fall of 2014, when the missing person case of Kira Blackwood turned into something that still haunts me. I was still new to the job, only 8 months in, when the call came through on that gray October evening. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the forest floor into a carpet of rotting leaves that muffled every sound. At 4:47 p.m., dispatch crackled through my radio with news that would change everything I thought I knew about the wilderness I'd sworn to protect. Ranger Thorne, we have a missing person report. Kira Blackwood, 23-year-old wildlife photographer. Last seen yesterday morning at the Hoh River trailhead. Vehicle still in parking lot. Over. I pressed the talk button, my thumb slipping slightly on the wet plastic. Copy that. Any additional details? Over. She was documenting elk migration patterns. Camping gear missing from vehicle, but no overnight permit filed. Family hasn't heard from her in 36 hours. You're primary on this one, Thorne. Weather window closing fast. Primary. My first solo missing person case. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like the heavy mist that clung to the Douglas firs towering around my patrol station. I'd been waiting for this moment since I'd finished training, desperate to prove I belonged here among the veterans who spoke in weather codes and moved through the forest like ghosts. Roger. Heading to last known location now. ETA 20 minutes. I grabbed my gear bag, checking the contents by habit. Emergency medical kit, GPS unit, extra batteries, emergency blanket, rope, headlamp, flares. My service pistol felt foreign on my hip. I'd drawn it exactly twice since starting the job, both times for aggressive black bears. The metallic taste of adrenaline filled my mouth as I climbed into my truck. The drive to Hoh River trailhead took me through cathedral-like groves of ancient trees, their trunks disappearing into fog 50 feet above. The windshield wipers squeaked against glass, a rhythmic reminder of how quickly darkness was approaching. In October, full dark came by 5:30 p.m., and searching in these conditions would be nearly impossible. Kira's vehicle sat alone in the gravel parking lot, a blue Subaru Outback with Washington plates and bumper stickers advertising camera equipment brands. I circled it slowly, noting the unlocked doors and the equipment still inside. Telephoto lenses, memory cards, a half-empty coffee cup that smelled sour in the damp air. Her camping gear was indeed missing, along with what looked like a professional camera body. I radioed in my initial observations and began examining the trailhead. The problem with searching after heavy rain is that it erases everything. Footprints become anonymous depressions in mud. Scents wash away. Even broken branches could be from wind rather than human passage. But I'd studied the textbooks, practiced with instructors. I knew what to look for. 20 yards up the main trail, I found it. A partial boot print in a protected area under an overhanging root system. Women's size 7 or 8 hiking boot with an aggressive tread pattern. It pointed north toward the interior backcountry, away from the maintained trails where most photographers stayed. "This is Ranger Thorne," I radioed back to dispatch. "I have a track heading north from the trailhead. Beginning pursuit. Over." "Copy, Thorne. Be advised, Ranger Wendell knows that area better than anyone. He worked those trails for 15 years before his transfer. Over." Marcus Wendell. I knew the name but had never met him. According to the other rangers, he'd been reassigned to administrative duties 3 years ago after some kind of family tragedy. The quiet guy who kept to himself, filed thorough reports, never caused problems. The kind of employee who blended into the background until he was gone. I shouldered my pack and started up the trail, following the faint depressions in the muddy earth. The rain had softened to a fine mist that penetrated my jacket and made everything slick. Every few minutes I'd find another partial print or a broken branch at shoulder height, confirming I was on the right track. The forest pressed close on both sides, creating a tunnel of green shadows that seemed to absorb sound. My boots squelched in the mud with each step, unnaturally loud in the stillness. Where were the birds? The usual forest sounds? Even the rain seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. After an hour of steady climbing, the official trail petered out into a network of game paths and unofficial routes used by experienced hikers. This was where most people turned back, where the real wilderness began. But the tracks continued, leading deeper into terrain I'd only seen on topographic maps during training. My GPS showed I was 3 miles from the nearest road, climbing toward a series of unmapped ridges that formed the heart of the park's backcountry. The battery indicator blinked reassuringly green, but I knew technology could fail. I marked my position and continued north. That's when I started finding the signs that made my skin crawl. First, it was a tree branch broken at exactly eye level. Too clean, too deliberate to be natural. Then another boot print, this one deeper and more clearly defined, pressed into mud beside a fallen log. But something was wrong with it. The stride length was inconsistent with someone walking normally. It was as if Kira had been moving erratically, or... I pushed the thought away. Missing persons often showed signs of disorientation, especially if they'd been lost for more than 24 hours. Hypothermia, dehydration, panic, all could cause irregular movement patterns. But then I found the camera. It lay partially hidden under a pile of freshly cut cedar boughs, as if someone had tried to conceal it. The expensive digital SLR was undamaged, but the memory card was missing. I photographed it in place with my phone before carefully bagging it as evidence. Professional photographers don't abandon thousands of dollars of equipment. Something had forced Kira to leave it behind. I radioed in the discovery, my voice echoing strangely in the thick air. "Dispatch, this is Thorne. I've located the missing person's camera. No sign of the subject yet, but I'm continuing to track north. Current position." I read off my GPS coordinates. Static crackled back for several seconds before dispatch responded. "Copy your location, Thorne. Be advised we're losing radio contact. Storm front moving in. Can you return to base?" I looked up at the darkening sky through the canopy. I had maybe an hour of usable light left, and returning now would mean losing the trail entirely. By morning, any remaining tracks would be washed away by the predicted heavy rainfall. Negative dispatch. The trail is fresh and I'm making good progress. I'll continue search until full dark, then establish emergency position for the night. Another burst of static. "Copy. Check in every minutes. Weather." The radio went quiet except for the occasional pop of interference. I was on my own now. Exactly like I'd trained for. Exactly like I'd wanted. This was my chance to prove that the quiet kid from the urban search and rescue program could handle the real wilderness. I pressed deeper into the forest, following the increasingly erratic trail. The tracks told a story I didn't want to read. Longer strides followed by sudden direction changes, scuff marks that suggested stumbling or running. At one point, I found what looked like fingernail gouges in the bark of a cedar tree, as if someone had grabbed it while falling. The smell hit me first. A sour, organic odor that cut through the clean scent of rain-washed forest. Human waste, but not fresh. Old enough to have started decomposing. I followed my nose to a depression between two fallen logs where someone had obviously made camp. Not a proper campsite, but a crude shelter built from branches and debris, and there were signs of more than one person. Two distinct boot patterns in the mud around the shelter. Kira's familiar tread, and something else. A larger boot with a different pattern. Size 11 or 12, with deep lugs designed for serious backcountry travel. The kind of boot a professional would wear. My training kicked in. Multiple persons in distress scenarios required different protocols. But something felt wrong about this scene. The shelter was too well constructed for someone in panic. The debris had been arranged with deliberate care, creating effective weather protection. This wasn't the desperate scraping together of materials by someone lost and frightened. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I photographed everything, though the failing light made good images difficult. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the bark of the nearest tree, almost invisible in the gathering darkness, were 3 words scratched in crude letters. Welcome to test. My hands started shaking as I read it again, hoping I'd made a mistake. But the letters were clear, deliberate, carved with something sharp. This wasn't a natural formation or accidental marking. Someone had left a message. I backed away from the shelter, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The forest around me could hide a dozen people, and I'd been announcing my presence with every radio call, every careless footstep. If someone was playing games out here, I'd walked right into their trap. The rational part of my mind tried to find innocent explanations. Wilderness enthusiasts sometimes carved messages. Maybe it was an old marking from some survival training exercise. Maybe Kira had carved it herself in some kind of desperate attempt to... No. The carving was too fresh, the letters too precise. And test suggested intention, planning. Someone was out here, someone who wanted to be found, who was leading me deeper into their territory. I needed to call for backup, but my radio produced only static. The GPS still functioned, but I was now over 4 miles from the nearest road, in terrain that would take hours to navigate even in good conditions. If I turned back now, I'd be hiking in complete darkness through unknown country. But if Kira was still alive, if she was somewhere ahead of me, every hour of delay might be the difference between rescue and recovery. I made the decision that haunts me. I continued north. The trail became harder to follow as darkness closed in. I switched to my headlamp, the narrow beam creating a tunnel of white light that seemed to make the surrounding darkness even more impenetrable. Every shadow could hide a threat, every sound, and there were sounds now. Soft movements in the underbrush that my light couldn't penetrate, sent adrenaline shooting through my system. The boot tracks led to what looked like an old game trail, narrow and winding, probably carved by generations of deer and elk moving between feeding areas. But someone had been using it recently, and often. The path was too well defined, too clear of debris to be maintained only by animals. I followed it for another half hour, my light bobbing ahead of me when I saw the glow. Firelight, warm and yellow, flickering between the trees maybe 50 yards ahead. My first instinct was relief. Fire meant warmth, shelter, possibly Kira herself. But training overrode emotion. I switched off my headlamp and moved forward carefully, placing each step with deliberate care to avoid snapping branches or rustling leaves. As I got closer, I could see the fire was built in a natural clearing surrounded by a circle of stones that showed signs of regular use. This was someone's established camp, not a desperate emergency fire. Sleeping gear was arranged neatly on one side, and I could see the silhouette of someone sitting with their back to me. "Kira?" I called softly, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. I crept closer, trying to make out details. Long dark hair, slender build, wearing what looked like hiking clothes. It had to be her. "Kira, my name is Ezra Thorne. I'm a park ranger. Your family sent me to find you." Still no response. Something was very wrong. I drew my pistol and switched on my headlamp, flooding the clearing with harsh white light. The scream that came out of my throat was involuntary, primitive. The figure by the fire wasn't sitting. It was propped up, held in place by branches driven into the ground behind it, and it wasn't Kira. It was a scarecrow made from park ranger clothing stuffed with leaves and debris. The hat was authentic. The shirt bore the National Park Service logo, and pinned to the chest was a name tag that read, M. Wendell. But what made me stumble backward in horror wasn't the crude effigy itself. It was what surrounded it. Dozens of photographs scattered around the fire like fallen leaves. Professional quality prints showing the interior of the forest, wildlife, landscapes. And in every single image, barely visible in the shadows, was the same figure watching from the trees. Someone had been documenting surveillance of the park for weeks, maybe months, and they'd been using Kira's camera to do it. "She takes beautiful pictures, doesn't she?" The voice came from directly behind me, calm and conversational, as if we were meeting at a coffee shop instead of a nightmare clearing in the middle of nowhere. I spun around, pistol raised, my light cutting through the darkness to illuminate a figure standing maybe 20 feet away. He looked exactly like what every ranger should look like: medium height, weathered face, practical clothes that had seen hard use. Gray hair peeked out from under a wool cap, and his stance spoke of someone comfortable in the wilderness. If I'd passed him on a trail, I would have nodded politely and continued walking. "Marcus Wendell," he said, as if reading my thoughts, "though I suppose you know that already." I kept my pistol trained on his chest, though my hands were shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could hit anything. "Where is Kira Blackwood?" "Safe. For now." He smiled, and something in that expression made my skin crawl. "The question is whether she stays that way. That depends entirely on you, Ranger Thorne." "I don't understand." "Of course you don't. You're new. Inexperienced. Exactly what I was hoping for when they assigned you to this case." He took a step closer, and I noticed he moved with the fluid economy of someone with military training. "Tell me, what do you know about testing?" "Stay back." My voice cracked like a teenager's. "I'm armed. So am I." His smile widened. "The difference is, I know how to use mine, but we'll get to that later. First, I want to show you something." He gestured toward the tree line, and my light caught the glint of something metallic attached to a pine trunk. Moving closer, I saw it was a photograph in a plastic sleeve, pinned to the bark with a knife. The image showed a young boy, maybe 8 years old, grinning at the camera while holding a fish. "My son, David. Lost him in these woods 3 years ago. Search and rescue spent 2 weeks looking. Brought in helicopters, dogs, dozens of volunteers. Know what they found?" I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. My throat had closed up completely. "Nothing. Not a trace. Like he just vanished." Marcus's voice remained conversational, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "They said he must have fallen in the river. Hypothermia, swift current. Body never recovered. Case closed." "I'm sorry for your loss, but nothing." The pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something predatory underneath. They gave up. All of them. Professional search and rescue personnel who were supposed to be the best at finding lost people. And they gave up on an 8-year-old boy after 2 weeks. He started walking in a slow circle around me, staying just at the edge of my light. I turned to keep him in sight, but the movement made me dizzy. So I decided to continue the search on my own. Took early retirement, sold everything I owned, moved into the backcountry permanently. And you know what I discovered? My finger tightened on the trigger. What? I found him. 3 months later, I found what was left of him. Not in the river, not anywhere near where they'd been looking. He'd made it almost 6 miles from where he was lost, Survived for at least a week on his own before... Marcus's voice trailed off. Before what? Before he failed the test. The words hung in the air between us like poison. I could hear my own heartbeat, unnaturally loud in the silence. You see, Ranger Thorne, the wilderness doesn't care about your training, your equipment, or your good intentions. It only cares about one thing. Are you strong enough to survive? My son wasn't. The search and rescue team wasn't. And now we're going to find out about you. I tried to key my radio with my free hand, but there was still only static. Marcus noticed the movement and laughed. Radio jammer, military grade. Amazing what you can buy on the internet these days. He pulled a small device from his pocket and showed it to me. GPS Scrambler 2. Your fancy technology won't help you here. What do you want? I want to see what you're made of. I want to know if the National Park Service is sending us rangers who can actually do the job, or just more weak links who will give up when things get difficult. His expression hardened. Kira failed her test. Photographer, supposed to be observant, supposed to notice details, but she walked right into my snare line like an amateur. Disappointing. Where is she? Close, alive, but probably not for much longer. Hypothermia is setting in, and she's lost a lot of blood from the leg snare. Unless, of course, someone rescues her in time. My mind raced. This was insane, but it was also an opportunity. If Kira was injured but alive, I could still save her. I just had to play along until I found an opening. What kind of test? Marcus nodded approvingly. Good. You're thinking tactically. That's more promising than most. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a topographic map, spreading it on a fallen log. Simple rules. I've hidden Miss Blackwood somewhere within a 2-mile radius of this position. You have until dawn to find her and get her to safety. I'll give you a 30-minute head start. And then I hunt you both. His smile returned, and this time there was nothing human in it. I know every game trail, every shelter, every hiding place in this forest. I know how rangers think, how they move, what mistakes they make under pressure. You'll be operating in my territory by my rules. I stared at the map, trying to memorize the terrain features, the potential hiding spots. There were dozens of places to conceal someone. Caves, dense thickets, old-growth stumps large enough to hollow out. It would take days to search them all systematically. Why are you doing this? Because someone needs to test the testers. Someone needs to make sure that when people's lives are on the line, we're sending rangers who won't give up, who won't quit when it gets hard. Marcus folded the map and slipped it back into his jacket. My son died because the people we trusted to find him weren't good enough. I won't let that happen again. This is murder. This is evolution. Natural selection. The weak die, the strong survive. He checked his watch, an old military model that didn't need GPS satellites. Your 30 minutes starts now. I backed away from the fire, keeping my pistol trained on him, trying to think. The smart move would be to try to take him down right now, force him to reveal Kira's location. But he was standing in shadows beyond my light, and something about his stance suggested he was ready for that possibility. Tick-tock, Ranger Thorne. I ran. The forest exploded around me as I crashed through the underbrush, no longer caring about noise or stealth. Branches whipped across my face, roots tried to trip me, and my headlamp beam bounced wildly with every step. But I was thinking, planning, trying to use what little training I had. Water. If Kira was injured and hypothermic, she'd need shelter from wind and rain. Marcus would have hidden her somewhere protected but not comfortable. A place where she'd survive long enough for the test, but not long enough to escape on her own. I pulled out my topographic map and compass, trying to navigate by dead reckoning since my GPS was useless. The terrain in this area included several seasonal streams, rock outcroppings that could provide shelter, and what looked like an old mining claim with abandoned structures. The mining claim was 2 miles northeast, about as far as I could realistically search in the time available. If Marcus was playing fair, and that was a huge if, it would be the logical hiding place. I adjusted my heading and pushed through a stand of young alders, their bare branches creating a maze of obstacles in the darkness. Every few minutes I stopped to listen, hoping to hear some sign of Kira, a cry for help, movement, anything. But the forest remained silent except for the soft patter of rain and my own labored breathing. 20 minutes into my head start, I found the first marker. It was another photograph, this one showing Kira tied to a tree with what looked like climbing rope. She was conscious in the image but obviously frightened, her eyes wide and pleading directly at the camera. Pinned below the photo was a note written in block letters, "Getting warmer." The psychological warfare was working. My hands shook as I studied the image, looking for clues about her location. The tree behind her looked like a large cedar, and there seemed to be a rocky outcropping visible in the background. It could be anywhere, but I forced myself to keep moving northeast toward the mining claim. The second marker came 10 minutes later. Another photo, this one showing Kira from a different angle. The rope around her wrists was tight enough to cut off circulation, and I could see dark stains on her pants that were probably blood from the leg snare Marcus had mentioned. But she was still alive, still fighting. "Closer," read the note below this image. I was definitely heading in the right direction, but my 30-minute head start was almost up. Soon Marcus would begin his hunt, and I'd be trying to find Kira while avoiding someone who knew this terrain far better than I did. The old mining claim sat in a bowl-shaped depression between two ridges, partially hidden by second-growth forest that had reclaimed the area decades ago. My light picked out the remains of wooden structures, rusted equipment, and what looked like the entrance to a shaft or tunnel cut into the hillside. And there, tied to a cedar tree at the edge of the clearing, was Kira Blackwood. She was conscious but barely responsive, her head lolling forward in a way that suggested exhaustion or blood loss. The climbing rope was wrapped around her torso and arms, securing her tightly to the trunk. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the dark stain spreading down her left leg. I approached carefully, scanning the shadows for any sign of Marcus. This felt too easy, too convenient, but Kira's condition was deteriorating rapidly. If I didn't act soon, she might not survive regardless of what games her captor was playing. "Kira? Can you hear me?" Her head came up slowly, eyes struggling to focus. "Help." The word was barely a whisper. I knelt beside her and began working on the ropes with my knife. They were tied with professional knots, the kind they taught in military survival courses. Marcus hadn't been exaggerating about his training. "I'm Ranger Thorne. Your family sent me to find you. We're going to get you out of here. He's coming back." Kira's voice was stronger now, but I could hear the fear. "He said he had to test someone new." "I know. Just stay calm. I'm almost..." The rope parted, and Kira slumped forward. I caught her, feeling how cold her skin was even through her jacket. Hypothermia was definitely setting in. I examined her injured leg quickly. The snare had bitten deep into her calf, but the bleeding had mostly stopped. Painful and debilitating, but not immediately life-threatening if I could get her warm and mobile. "Can you walk?" "I think so. But he'll hear us. He hears everything." She was right. Moving through the forest with an injured person would be slow and noisy. Marcus could track us easily, especially if he had night vision equipment. I needed a different strategy. "Listen to me carefully. I'm going to help you get to that old mining shack, and then I'm going to set a trap." Kira stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "A trap?" "He thinks he's hunting a scared rookie. He thinks he has all the advantages. But he made one mistake. He told me exactly what this is about. This isn't really a test for me. It's therapy for him. He's trying to work through losing his son by creating scenarios where he has control." I helped Kira to her feet, supporting most of her weight as we limped toward the abandoned structures. She was tougher than she looked. Most people would have been in shock by now, but she was still thinking clearly. "So what's the trap?" People with trauma follow patterns. They repeat behaviors that gave them control in the past, even when those behaviors are destructive. Marcus found his son's body after the official search gave up. That made him feel powerful, competent, like he succeeded where others failed. We reached the mining shack, really just 3 walls and part of a roof, but it would provide some shelter and concealment. I settled Kira in the most protected corner and began laying out my equipment. He's going to track us here probably within the next few minutes. When he does, he'll expect to find 2 helpless victims waiting for him. Instead, he's going to find someone who studied his psychology and prepared accordingly. I pulled out my emergency flares, not the handheld kind, but the larger ground flares designed for helicopter signaling. Then I arranged my remaining gear to look like we'd tried to barricade ourselves inside the shack but failed. What if you're wrong about him? Then we're probably going to die. I checked my pistol, making sure I had a round chambered and the safety off. But I don't think I'm wrong. Marcus isn't really a predator. He's a grieving father who broke under pressure and created a fantasy where he gets to be the hero instead of the victim. That doesn't make him less dangerous. No, it makes him more dangerous because he believes his own story, but it also makes him predictable. I heard it then, the soft sound of someone moving through the forest with practiced stealth. Marcus was coming, exactly as I'd hoped. I positioned myself behind the partial wall where I had a clear view of the most likely approach routes, then waited. He appeared at the tree line like a ghost, barely visible even with my night-adapted vision. But I'd been watching the right spot, and I caught the movement as he studied the shack from cover. He was being careful, professional, treating this like a real tactical situation, which meant he was also being predictable. Marcus approached from the southeast, using a fallen log for concealment, exactly as I'd expected given the terrain and sight lines. He paused about 30 yards out, probably listening for sounds from inside the shack, then began a slow, methodical advance. I let him get within 20 feet before I triggered the first flare. The forest exploded in brilliant red light, turning night into day and destroying Marcus's night vision instantly. He threw himself sideways behind a tree, but I was already moving, using the cover of a second flare to circle around behind his position. "End game, Marcus!" I had him dead to rights, pistol trained on his back from 15 feet away. He was trapped between me and the flares silhouetted against the burning light with nowhere to run. But when he turned around, he was smiling. "Very good, Ranger Thorn. Better than I expected." He raised his hand slowly, but something about his posture was wrong. Too relaxed, too confident for someone who'd just been outmaneuvered. "Drop any weapons and lie face down on the ground." "I don't think so." Marcus tilted his head slightly, and I heard it, a soft mechanical clicking from somewhere behind me. "You see? You made the same mistake every rookie makes. You assumed this was about you." I spun around just as Kira stood up from her hiding place in the shack, a pistol in her hands pointed directly at my chest. The injured leg that had been bleeding freely just minutes ago now supported her weight without any sign of weakness. "She's been my partner for 6 months," Marcus explained conversationally. "Amazing what you can do with fake blood and a little theater training. Kira's quite the actress when she needs to be." My mind reeled. The missing person report, filed by her accomplice, not her family. We needed fresh meat for the test, someone new who wouldn't recognize either of us. Kira's voice was completely different now, colder, more calculating. The scared photographer act was just to make you feel heroic. "You're both insane." "We're survivors," Marcus corrected. "And we're teachers. The rangers they're sending out these days are soft, unprepared for the real dangers in the wilderness. We're fixing that problem one lesson at a time. By murdering people? By testing them. Some pass like you just did. Others?" He shrugged. "Darwin was right about natural selection." I kept my pistol trained on Marcus, but I could feel Kira's weapon aimed at my back. Classic crossfire position. If I shot one, the other would kill me instantly. "How many others?" "You're number 7. 3 passed the test and were recruited. 3 failed and became cautionary tales. You get to choose which category you belong in." The flares were burning down and shadows were creeping back across the clearing. In a few minutes, I'd lose the visual advantage entirely. "What makes you think I'd join you?" "Because you're smart enough to recognize superior training when you see it. Because you've just proven you can think tactically under pressure. And because..." Marcus smiled that predatory smile again. The alternative is dying here tonight and being reported as another tragic accident during a routine search and rescue operation. I thought about my options. 2 armed opponents, one behind and one in front, both with military training and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Even if I managed to take down one of them, the other would kill me before I could acquire a second target. But they'd made one crucial error in their psychological profile. They'd assumed I was like them. I need time to think about this. Of course, but not too much time. Dawn is only a few hours away and we have cleanup to finish before then. I nodded slowly, as if considering their offer, then pulled the pin on my last flare and threw it directly at Kira. She dove to avoid the burning magnesium, and in that split second I rolled behind the nearest tree. Marcus's first shot splintered bark inches from my head, but I was already moving, using the chaos and smoke to break their crossfire pattern. The flare ignited dried leaves around the shack, creating a small wildfire that spread rapidly through the accumulated debris. Within minutes, the entire clearing was filled with smoke and dancing shadows that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. I heard them calling to each other, trying to coordinate, but the fire was growing faster than they'd anticipated. The old mining structures were tinder dry and caught flame immediately, creating a wall of heat and light that drove all of us back toward the tree line. That's when I heard the helicopters. The sound started as a distant rumble but grew quickly into the distinctive whap, whap, whap of rotors cutting through air. Search and rescue, probably launched when I'd failed to check in as scheduled. The fire would be visible for miles, drawing them directly to our location. Marcus realized it too. His carefully controlled test scenario was collapsing into chaos, and soon there would be dozens of real rangers swarming the area. Whatever psychological games he'd been playing were about to end. "We need to go," I heard Kira shout over the noise of the fire and approaching aircraft. "Now!" They were retreating, falling back into the forest where helicopters couldn't follow. I had a choice: pursue them into unknown terrain where they held every advantage, or stay with the fire and wait for backup. I chose backup. 20 minutes later, the clearing was swarming with search and rescue personnel, firefighters, and law enforcement. I gave them the abbreviated version. I'd tracked a missing person to this location, discovered evidence of foul play, and been attacked by 2 suspects who'd fled when the fire started. The investigation that followed found plenty of evidence to support my story. The photographs scattered around Marcus's camp, the rope that had been used to tie up the fake victim, and most damning of all, remains buried near the mining claim that turned out to be Marcus Wendell's son, David. But they never found Marcus or Kira. The official report concluded that Marcus had suffered a psychotic break following his son's death, and had recruited an accomplice to help him act out his revenge fantasies against the Park Service. The missing person report on Kira Blackwood was revealed to be fraudulent, filed by an unknown individual using false information. They offered me counseling, commendation for my actions under extreme circumstances, and reassignment to a different park if I wanted it. I declined all 3. If Marcus and Kira were still out there, still testing rangers, someone needed to be watching for them. That was 10 years ago. I'm still at Olympic National Park, still working the backcountry, still hoping that someday I'll get the chance to finish what we started in that burning clearing. Because I learned something important that night. The most dangerous predator in any wilderness isn't a bear or a cougar, or even the elements. It's another human being who's convinced themselves that what they're doing is justified. And they're still out there, somewhere in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, looking for their next test subject. The rangers they recruit are taught to recognize the signs: missing person reports that don't quite add up, crime scenes that feel staged, and evidence that seems designed to draw you deeper into the woods. But most importantly, we watch for partners who appear exactly when you need them most, who seem too competent for their supposed situation, and who always seem to know just a little more about what's happening than they should. Because sometimes the person you're trying to save is the one who's actually hunting you. I still wake up some nights thinking about that smile Marcus gave me when he realized I'd figured out his game. It wasn't the expression of someone who'd been caught. It was the look of a teacher who was proud that his student had finally learned the lesson. That's what terrifies me most about that night. Not the gunfight, not the fire, not even the realization that I'd been manipulated from the very beginning. What keeps me awake is the growing suspicion that I didn't really escape at all. Because 3 weeks after the incident, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, me, standing in the burning clearing with my pistol drawn, taken from an angle that could only have been captured by someone hiding in the trees beyond the firelight. Someone who'd stayed behind to watch, to document, to grade my performance. Written on the back in the same block letters I'd seen carved into that tree were 4 words: "Welcome to advanced class." I've never reported receiving that photograph. I tell myself it's because there's no evidence to pursue, no leads that would help catch them. But the truth is more complicated than that. Part of me, a part I don't like to acknowledge, is curious about what advanced class might involve. Sometimes when I'm alone in the backcountry tracking real missing persons, I catch myself analyzing the terrain differently. I notice things I never saw before. Natural choke points where someone could set up an ambush, cave systems that could hide supplies for months, game trails that would allow movement without leaving tracks on established paths. And sometimes, in the peripheral vision of my headlamp beam, I think I see familiar figures watching from the shadows. When I turn to look directly, there's never anyone there. But I can feel their eyes on me, evaluating, measuring, deciding whether I'm ready for whatever comes next. The other rangers have started to notice changes in my behavior. I volunteer for the most dangerous assignments, the ones that send you deepest into the wilderness with the least backup. I've developed what they call 1,000-yard stare, the look of someone who's seen too much and expects to see more. They think it's trauma from that night at the mining claim, post-traumatic stress from my encounter with a madman and his accomplice. But I know better. I'm not traumatized. I'm prepared. Because I've figured out something that terrifies me more than Marcus or Kira or any of their tests. I've realized that on some level they were right. The rangers they're sending into the wilderness these days aren't ready for what's really out there. We're trained to find lost hikers and treat snake bites and educate tourists about leave-no-trace principles. We're not trained to hunt human predators who've studied our methods, learned our weaknesses, and turned our own protocols against us. But I am now. Last month, I tracked a missing college student for 3 days through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate without leaving obvious sign. Every time I thought I'd lost the trail, I'd find a subtle marker leading me deeper into the backcountry. A broken branch here, a disturbed rock pile there, evidence that felt natural but guided me in a specific direction. I found the student on the 4th day, hypothermic but alive, tied to a tree in a clearing that looked remarkably similar to the one where I'd first encountered Kira. The ropes were tied with the same military knots. The psychological setup was identical. But this time, I was ready. I didn't approach the victim immediately. Instead, I spent 2 hours studying the surrounding forest, identifying sight lines and approach routes, looking for the watchers I knew were there. When I finally spotted them, 2 figures concealed in a blind constructed from natural materials, I realized they weren't Marcus and Kira. They were new players. Recruits, probably, learning the techniques and psychology of testing rangers, which meant the organization was growing, spreading, becoming something more than just one broken man's revenge fantasy. I could have called for backup. Should have, according to every protocol I'd ever learned. But backup would have meant helicopters and sirens and a response so overwhelming that the recruiters would simply melt back into the forest to try again somewhere else. So I made a different choice. I rescued the college student, treated his hypothermia, and got him safely to the trailhead without ever acknowledging that I'd seen his captors. Then I filed a report describing the incident as a case of someone getting lost, becoming disoriented, and injuring themselves while trying to build emergency shelter. No mention of restraints, no mention of watchers, no mention of tests. 2 days later, I found another unmarked package waiting for me. This one contained a topographical map with a red X marked in a remote section of the park I'd never explored, along with a handwritten note. Advanced Placement Evaluation. Next Saturday, AO 200 hours. Come alone. Bring everything you've learned. I should have turned that note over to the FBI. Should have coordinated with other agencies to set up a proper tactical response. Should have done everything by the book to shut down what was clearly an expanding criminal organization. Instead, I've spent the last week preparing for Saturday night. I've studied the marked location, planned approach routes, cached supplies at strategic points along the way. I've modified my equipment, adding items that aren't standard ranger issue but might be necessary for the kind of encounter I'm expecting. And I've written this account, partly as a record of what's happened, but mostly as insurance in case I don't come back, because I've realized something that changes everything. I don't want to shut them down anymore. I want to understand them. The wilderness is changing. Climate shift is driving both animals and people into new territories, creating unpredictable encounters between predator and prey. Drug trafficking organizations are using national parks as distribution routes, bringing violence into areas that were once sanctuaries. And every year, more people venture into the backcountry without proper training or respect for what they're entering. The old methods of park management aren't working anymore. We need rangers who can think like soldiers, who understand that protecting the wilderness sometimes means fighting for it. Rangers who've been tested under the worst possible conditions and proven they won't break when lives are on the line. Maybe that's what Marcus and his people are really doing. Maybe they're not creating monsters. They're forging weapons. Tomorrow night, I'm going to find out. If you're reading this, it means something went wrong. Either I didn't survive the advanced placement evaluation, or I passed and decided not to come back to the world of official reports and bureaucratic protocols. Either way, you need to know. They're still out there, still testing, still recruiting, and they're getting better at it. The forest has always been dangerous, but in 2014 it became dangerous in ways we never anticipated. The greatest threat to people seeking refuge in nature isn't exposure or wildlife or getting lost. It's the people who've decided that only the strong deserve to survive, and who've made themselves judge, jury, and executioner for anyone who enters their territory. Watch for the signs. Trust your instincts. And remember that sometimes the person offering to help you might be the one you should fear most. My name is Ezra Thorne, and I was 28 years old when I learned that the real predators walk on two legs and carry badges that used to mean something. If I don't make it back from Saturday night, tell them I went hunting. And if you see someone who looks like me in the woods after that date, be very careful about accepting their help, because by then, I might not be coming to rescue you. I might be testing whether you deserve to survive.